So as it turns out, the quill and the head assembly on this machine wound up being the most difficult assembly to deal with. I think just simply because when it was sitting outside, the rain was collecting inside the head and going down inside of the quill, and so as a result it was very difficult to get some of the stuff apart. A lot of rust and corrosion. And of course I had to try that. I pretty much knew that was seized, but I had to try. So I went to the auto parts store and got a Ford four-wheel drive hub socket, and I knew that the outside diameter was a little too big when I purchased it, but it was the closest fit to the nut that's down inside this recess. So I just turned it down. It was a little bit slow going. Obviously this is a hardened socket, so it took a little bit to get it trimmed down so I could fit it inside the hole, but it did work. Not a perfect fit, but when you put an impact gun on it, guess what? Something's going to give, and the nut gave. So it worked out in the end. It did pull the thread slightly, so I had to basically hand lap with some oil back and forth for about 10 minutes, and I finally got it to where I could turn it by hand easily without the aid of the socket, so it worked out. That's the brake assembly for the vertical quill. Glad that's on there because it really makes tool changing a lot easier. And of course, there's always got to be one snap ring that gets you, and this is the one that got me in the whole project. There's a bazillion snap rings on this machine, and that's the one that got me. Didn't really hurt, but it's always scary when you have a big piece of metal like that coming at you. The quill was very difficult to get apart. A lot of rust inside, and no amount of PB or working it back and forth was getting it done. And so at some point I decided to stop being nice to it, and I got out the big hammer, and knowing that I was going to mar the end of the shaft, I went for it because it wasn't coming apart, and you can see the amount of rust that's inside of it. So I did wind up chucking up the spindle in the lathe and just put a little bit of a taper on the end where the splines are, and it was fine. A little bit of hand filing and no problem. And that's after the evaporust there. You can see it did a really good job compared to what it did look like. Obviously there's some pitting there, and there are some parts that I could have turned down, refaced, and made them look a lot better, but decided not to do that. My goal here is not to make a pristine example of a Rockwell milling machine. It is to have a functional machine that works as intended. Does it look nice in the end? Yes, but is it perfect? No. My blast cabinet is pretty small, but I was still able to process quite a few parts through it. Saved me a lot of work, and just went by with a file and piece of sandpaper. I did do some die grinding here and there and cleaned up stuff. You can see here that I'm using a Scotch-Brite disc to deal with the column for the head, and it cleaned up very nicely. I spent a lot of time working on it. It took me a really, really long time. I did not use one piece of sandpaper on it. It's all with maroon Scotch-Brite pad and wire wheel, and managed to get a really good result, I think, for where I was at. So Just doing a little degrease with some acetone and getting all the machine surfaces taped off, getting it ready for paint. I put a couple of 12 by 24 AC filters on the front side of my exhaust fan, and it really helps with pulling the paint particles out of the air. Um, Having the booth area curtained off like it is, it does a really good job of pulling. If you see that piece of newspaper there that I'm using as my test panel, the that it's getting sucked by the fan. So if you watch while I'm painting, the overspray that's in the air, it's getting pulled out very quickly. If you can get a touch-up gun to work right with the paint that you're using, I really recommend it, because being able to paint something like this is nearly impossible even with the HVLP gun, just because it's so hard to get the spray up inside of something, around corners and into recesses. And the touch-up gun, you can really dial it down and control the amount of spray very easily, much easier than a full-size HVLP gun. I've never used a mini HVLP gun. I don't know if they're any better, but I have a big DeVelbus gun for automotive painting, and you can't do this kind of stuff with that. It's just too much. It's meant for cars, not for small parts. So there you can see I've got all of my parts cleaned up, ready to go, and new bearings all around. The bearings for the quill are a single seal, so it's open on one side so you can pack the bearing with grease, and then the outside has a seal. So when you assemble the two bearings together, you put the open sides together, and when you tighten the nut down on it, it effectively seals the center against the two races, and keeps everything inside. And I know that's true because the first 5 minutes or so that I started the motor up, I let it just run at about 300 or 400 RPM, and I had some fling out of grease. It was very little residual grease, and it's basically what was outside of the bearing from assembly. After about 5 minutes, the fling out stopped, and I haven't seen grease since. So seems to be sealing effectively. So there's the brake assembly all back together and working as it should. Because of the design of this, it's very compact, so you have to put this in a very specific way. Rockwell did not do anyone any favors with that pin sticking out of the bottom there. I've seen quite a bit of consternation online about that pin design. But if you use the right sequence, you can get around it even when it's all rusted together. Here I'm indexing and test fitting the drive hub for the pulley. to the spindle, there's 6 possible ways that it could go on, and I found that it will only go completely on in 3 of those positions, and only 2 of those positions are actually viable, and only 1 of those is actually the right place. So I didn't do any measuring. I don't know which part is irregular, but one of them is irregular. Or it could just be that that's the way it was worn from previously. It just wants to fit in that one slot, and it fits very nicely. And there's no play. Although the pulley on the end of the hub there looks pretty sad. It really doesn't matter. It's just for driving the belt, and if you use it on that position for some period of time, it will smooth out to some extent. Although I think that one's the one that gets the spindle up to 6,200 RPM, so I don't know that I'll be using that a whole lot. But anyways, it will still work, even though it looks kind of sad. Sorry about the focus in this shot here. I wanted to make sure that you could see down inside of the hub assembly. And as you can see, that the nut does have some deformation from the socket and the nut being quite aligned properly, but it's not a big deal. Before it was seized and it was really tight. Now it's just snug, and the lock ring is holding it in place. And it's got plenty of oil, and I fitted it very well, so shouldn't be a problem. It's just cosmetic. It functions as it should and doesn't affect the machine in any way. Here you can see I'm dressing some of the parts, and I'm making a keyway for the adjustment to the head to be able to position the head at a given angle, which by the way doesn't work that well, but it is there, and that scale is pretty well meaningless. I used some Johnson paste wax on the shaft there to help protect it and keep it from rusting, and so far it's been a while since I applied it, and I don't have any surface rust appearing at all. It's basically got it sealed up very well. So that's the hand wheel for the fine feed for the quill, and I'll be honest, it doesn't really work that well, but it's there. I took care of it and cleaned it up and everything, but it's kind of awkward to use, and it may just need to get broke in. It probably never got used by the previous user for the same reason that I probably won't use it either. But maybe if I work with it a little bit and break it in, it may work a little better, but I can just grab the quill handle and feed it myself. So just going through the grits, and finally wind up with some steel wool and brasso, and shine up the outside a bit, put some paint on it, and call it good. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.